Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The Fall of Rome, and we're going to talk about 5 things that, as you read more about this topic, you should think about or focus on in order to start to get a sense of really what happened to the Roman political state in the 5th and 6th centuries. Let's get into it. The first term for us, or the first thing for us to be thinking about, are reasons and Edward Gibbons. So, the debate over the fall or the collapse or the decline of the Roman political state in the West is something that has occurred since it happened in the 5th century. In the 18th century, a fairly prominent writer, historian, Edward Gibbons, writes a book called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's quite massive. It makes the argument that Rome fell because of Christianity and barbarism, as it terms it. If anything, the debate and the historiography on this is continual and unending. And there's a lot of different reasons why a Roman political state in the West ceased to exist by the end of the 5th century. Now, does aspects of Roman culture continue? Do aspects of Roman economic policy continue in certain forms? Do certain forms of the Latin language continue, or Roman law, sort of this kind of thing in the West continue? There are certain aspects of that transition, but in the idea of an imperial Roman political state, right, that fundamentally is gone, and there's a lot of reasons for that, right? So certainly economic collapse are a part of that, difficulties with military policy, right? There's a lot of different sort of aspects that contribute to this by the time you get to the early 5th century, which kind of brings us to our second point, which is invasions, right? So the Roman political state, especially in the West, by the time you get into the early 5th century, is going to be subject to a number of different forms of attack. The capital itself, will be moved from Rome to a number of other areas, Ravenna included. So those who would have been living within the Italian peninsula in the 5th century would have had an incredibly difficult time. There's a fairly substantive invasion in 408 with Alaric. There's an even greater one in 410 where Alaric's forces destroy Rome. Alaric would die, but larger sort of actions against sort of central parts of the Roman world are going to take place in the 430s, 440s, 450s. Attacks against Attila in 451 occur, and there's a very prominent plunder of Rome by a Vandal leader by the name of Gazeric in the year 455. So, the 5th century, you have these larger military forces, right, that sort of come in and plunder, and it's very difficult. There's very little that a organized Roman military force can necessarily do about this. This brings us to our third point, which is the Eastern Roman world. So, of course, in the aftermath of the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, you'd seen a shifting of economic focus, of militarized focus, and of political focus to the east. Some leaders will attempt forms of reunion. Certainly, Constantius does this, Julian does this, Theodosius I does this. But you have this divergent track that occurs for both sections of the empire by the time you get to the end of the 4th century, and by the time you get to the end of the 5th century. By the time you get to the 5th century, right, the Eastern Roman Empire that we now refer to, of course, as the Byzantine world, is relatively ascendant, while the political state in the West is collapsing. Troops can't, of course, get paid, and the Roman outposts are starting to be abandoned, right? This kind of thing is occurring with earnest. This brings us to our fourth point, So generally, this is the idea of chroniclers or sources from the time, right? So commonly in the aftermath of the collapse of the Roman world, we tend to think for a very long time, the term that was often used was the Dark Ages. To think about this term for a few centuries after the collapse of the Roman political state in the West. Now, it's a loaded term. It's a loaded term, and there's a few things to unpack with it. First is it's often referred to as dark because the idea is that Roman legal authority was so great, and since Rome isn't in power anymore, it's obviously a time of darkness where these barbarian forces are in power, right? Which is, it's kind of patronizing for some of these groups that kind of come in, right? That's one part of this. A second thing for us to consider with that is the idea that we don't have a lot of sources. There's not a lot of written work, especially from the 5th and 6th centuries. What do we know? What do we have record of, right? So those who would have been in the Italian peninsula, those who would have been in some of these urban areas in the Roman world, we do have some chroniclers from that time, and a lot of their writing is about the idea that the Roman world for them was everything, and so in a way, the world was ending. Now, the world literally wasn't ending, but their understanding of the world was transforming. And so those sources tend to shape a lot of what is sort of initially written, and so then that and their view, right, makes a big deal, right? It sort of is a big deal. And that brings us to our fifth point. And the fifth point is Germanic kingdoms. So in the former sort of Western, European, former Roman political state there in the West, you're going to see a number of Germanic tribal groups and kingdoms emerge, beginning at the end of the 5th century after the German leader Odoacer, who deposes an emperor by the name of Orestes and his son Romulus Augustus. They do so in the year 476. And this brings us really kind of into a post-Roman world where you will have a number of different institutions and religions and kingdoms that will be vying for control in the spaces that the Roman political state had once inhabited. Thank you very much.